He wrote of high society, glittering balls, and grand romance. But he also wrote of the brutal, chaotic, unforgiving nature of war, because he had seen it, he had lived it. The soldier, who would become the world's greatest novelist. He gave us War and Peace, a book that contains the entire human soul. But the greatest war he ever fought was not on the battlefield. It was inside himself. The aristocrat who became a peasant, the sinner who sought to be a saint. The ultimate paradox of a man. If you're ready to explore the story of a mind as vast and contradictory as Russia itself, subscribe now and join us as we begin our epic journey into the life of Leo Tolstoy. Born into the gilded cage of Russian aristocracy, Leo Tolstoy seemed destined for a life of privilege and leisure. But even in his youth, orphaned early and surrounded by vast wealth, a sense of unease, a restless spirit simmered beneath the surface. He drifted through university, finding no solace in academic pursuits. The rigid structure and dry lectures could not contain his surging mind. He plunged into the glittering but ultimately empty world of Moscow society. Gambling became a dangerous addiction, threatening to consume his inheritance. The vast estates, symbols of his noble lineage, began to dwindle, sold off to appease creditors. The life of a carefree count was proving unsustainable. He sought refuge in fleeting pleasures, carousing with gypsies, nights of heavy drinking, a desperate search for meaning in hedonism. But it was a path that led only to further emptiness. Looking in the mirror, he saw not a charming nobleman, but a hollow shell, a man lost in a cycle of self-destruction. Even his attempts at good deeds, like starting a school for his peasants, were marred by his own lack of direction and discipline. Good intentions were not enough to overcome his inner turmoil. Desperate for an escape, for a purpose beyond the endless cycle of debt and fleeting pleasure, he made a rash decision to join the army, trading the silks and finery of a count for the rough cloth of a soldier's uniform. He sought a new identity, a new beginning, far from the suffocating constraints of his past. He journeyed south to the Caucasus, a wild frontier region where Russia was constantly at war. It was a landscape as untamed and unpredictable as his own soul. Standing on the rugged peaks amidst the grandeur of the mountains, he hoped to find something he had always lacked: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of himself. But the small conflicts of the Caucasus were soon overshadowed by a far greater conflagration: the Crimean War, and Tolstoy found himself thrust into the very heart of it. The siege of Sevastopol was hell on earth, a landscape of mud and blood, choked with the acrid smoke of constant bombardment. Death was a constant companion. In the trenches, the romantic notions of military glory were instantly shattered by the brutal reality of exploding shells and the screams of the dying. Fear became the dominant emotion. He witnessed young men, barely more than boys, their lives extinguished in the mud. The true cost of war, the human cost, was laid bare in all its horrifying detail. As an artillery officer, Tolstoy was competent, even courageous. But the constant carnage, the sheer waste of life, began to chip away at his soul. Makeshift hospitals overflowing with the wounded, the stench of death, the relentless chaos. War was not a heroic adventure, but a brutal, dehumanizing nightmare. During the brief lulls in the fighting, he would look at his own hands, stained with gunpowder and the dirt of the trenches, and begin to question everything he had ever believed in. The glorious paintings of heroic battles he had once admired now seemed like grotesque lies in the face of the suffering he witnessed daily. He saw the vast gulf between the detached, often incompetent, aristocratic officers far behind the lines, and the common soldiers who bore the brunt of the fighting and dying. Standing amidst the carnage after a particularly brutal assault, the gentle fall of snow seemed like a surreal and tragic counterpoint to the horrors that surrounded him. The Crimean War was the crucible in which the reckless count began to transform. The romantic illusions of youth were burned away by the searing heat of reality. A profound and lasting change took root within him. He had seen the truth of war in all its ugliness and futility, and a powerful conviction began to form within him. This story needed to be told. In the cramped, dimly lit confines of a bunker, amidst the sounds of distant explosions, Tolstoy began to write. Not official reports, but personal observations, raw and unfiltered. His soldier's hand, calloused and stained, now moved across the page, transcribing the horrors he had witnessed, turning pain into prose, death into words. These writings would become Sevastopol sketches, honest and unflinching depictions of the war. The first tentative steps towards the epic masterpiece that lay dormant within him. As he sailed away from the ravaged shores of Crimea, he looked not back at the land of conflict, but inward at the burgeoning consciousness of a writer. The Count and the soldier were fading away. Leo Tolstoy, the author, was being born. Returning from the war, Tolstoy was no longer a reckless youth. He was a literary lion. His raw, honest Sevastopol sketches had made him a celebrity in the salons of St. Petersburg. The intellectual elite celebrated him. They saw a powerful new voice, a writer of immense talent. But Tolstoy quickly grew tired of their abstract debates and philosophical posturing. He found them arrogant and disconnected from the realities of life and death he had witnessed. While they talked about theories, he was still haunted by the visceral truth of the trenches, a truth they could never understand. This is the disconnect that would define his life. He felt like an alien among them, a man who had seen too much to indulge in their intellectual games. So, in a characteristically defiant move, he turned his back on them all. Leaving the glittering capital for the solitude of his country estate, he began to travel Europe, searching for a new purpose. Not in art, but in education, in philosophy, in finding a better way to live. He found the systems of the West rigid and soulless. He realized the answers he was looking for were not outside, but within. He returned to his home, Yasnaya Polyana, determined to build his own world, based on his own principles. He poured his energy into a school for peasant children, one based on freedom and respect. He was building a new life, a new philosophy. He was gathering the vast intellectual and historical knowledge that would soon be required for an impossibly ambitious project. But he knew something was missing. For a man whose soul was a raging storm, he needed an anchor. He found that anchor in the intelligent and fiercely capable Sophia Bears. He fell in love instantly and completely. In her, he saw not just a wife, but a partner, a mind that could match his own. Their courtship was a brief period of rare, uncomplicated happiness. A quiet walk in the woods before the monumental task to come. They married in 1862. It was the beginning of one of the most famous, fruitful, and turbulent literary partnerships in history. Sophia immediately brought order to his chaotic life. She managed the vast estate, his finances, his entire world, freeing his mind to focus on one thing. She was the calm center of his chaotic universe, the anchor that allowed his ship to weather the storm of his own genius. She was his first reader, his sharpest critic, and his most fervent believer. And most importantly, she undertook a Herculean task. Night after night, she would decipher his messy, chaotic drafts and copy them out by hand into a clean manuscript. Sometimes she copied the entire novel 7 times over. Without her discipline, it is very likely the world's greatest novel would have remained an unreadable, unfinished scrawl. With Sophia by his side, Tolstoy began. He was not writing a novel. He was attempting to capture the soul of an entire nation during one of its most defining moments. He breathed life into hundreds of characters, from emperors and generals on a vast historical stage, to the intricate, intimate, and deeply human lives of fictional families whose fates would captivate the world. For 6 years, they lived inside the world of war and peace. It was a colossal undertaking, a work of obsessive historical research and profound philosophical inquiry. The manuscript was a living, breathing monster, a mountain of paper that threatened to consume them both. And it was Sophia who tamed that monster, transforming her husband's chaotic genius into a structured masterpiece. Finally, the last page was written. The war was over. War and Peace was complete. It was more than a book. It was a universe. A literary monument that would stand for all time. Tolstoy had achieved a level of literary immortality few have ever reached. But for a man like him, the summit of one mountain only reveals a higher, more dangerous peak to climb. The war with Napoleon was over. But his war with God was just beginning. He had done it. He had written the great Russian novel, had achieved a fame and fortune beyond measure, and it left him completely empty. But for a mind like Tolstoy's, literary immortality was a hollow prize. He looked upon his own masterpieces and saw only vanity, a meaningless distraction from the terrifying questions of life and death. So began his next great obsession, a frantic, desperate search for meaning, tearing through the world's religions and philosophies, looking for an answer. He fell into a profound depression, haunted by the specter of his own mortality. He had written the human soul, but he could not save his own. And then, in the depths of his despair, he found it. A personal, radical reinterpretation of the Gospels. He believed he had uncovered the true, simple, and demanding essence of Christianity. He began to write again, not with the nuance of a novelist, but with the unbending certainty of a prophet. His new works were not stories, but edicts. Radical attacks on the state, on the church, on private property, on society itself. He declared himself a Christian anarchist, a pacifist who believed all governments were inherently violent and immoral. The man who had once squandered his fortune on gambling now sought to give it all away in an act of radical charity. The government saw him as a threat, the church as a heretic. But his fame was so immense, they dared not touch him. He was untouchable, a moral and spiritual superpower, waging a war of ideas against the entire Russian Empire from his remote country estate. And people listened. Disciples, known as Tolstoyans, began to flock to Yasnaya Polyana to learn from the master. His transformation was total. The Count became a peasant. He shed the clothes of his class, adopting the simple tunic of the workers. He renounced his former life, taking up manual labor, working the fields, and making his own shoes, seeking salvation in simplicity. In his most radical act, he renounced the copyrights to his great literary works, declaring them the property of humanity, a decision that would have devastating consequences for his family. He tried to give away his land, his wealth, everything. He no longer wanted to be a master, but a brother to all mankind. From his estate, he preached a gospel of radical love, nonviolence, and spiritual purity. His ideas spread far beyond Russia, planting a seed in the mind of a young Indian lawyer named Mahatma Gandhi, who would use Tolstoy's principles of nonviolent resistance to change the world. He had become a global icon, a beacon for a new way of thinking. He rejected all worldly pleasures, becoming a vegetarian, an ascetic, a man at war with his own aristocratic past. The Russian Orthodox Church, infuriated by his teachings, officially excommunicated him, casting him out as a heretic. But this only solidified his status. To his followers, he was now a martyr, a living saint. He began to see himself as a spiritual guide for all humanity. The God's elder brother that others saw in him, he now saw in the mirror. He had found his ultimate purpose. But his quest for spiritual purity would create a storm of earthly chaos right in the heart of his own home. This is where the story turns from a literary biography into a tragedy. The grand dining room of Yasnaya Polyana became a silent battlefield. His wife Sophia, the woman who had been his anchor, his partner, the co-creator of his masterpieces, was now his adversary. She watched in horror as the man she loved tried to give away their children's inheritance, dismantling the life she had worked so hard to build and protect. Their once great partnership descended into a bitter daily war. She fought to preserve the family's legacy. He fought to escape it. His quest for a universal, abstract love for mankind had destroyed his intimate, personal love for his own family. It is the most painful paradox of his life. And so he stood, a prophet to the world, but a tyrant in his own home, surrounded by adoring followers, but profoundly and tragically alone. At the age of 82, the tension in his home became unbearable. He felt his life's work, his very soul, was being compromised. The grand estate of Yasnaya Polyana, once his sanctuary, had become his prison. A final, desperate act of rebellion was brewing. He wrote a final, heartbreaking letter to his wife of 48 years, Sophia, a farewell to a life he could no longer endure. In the dead of a cold October night, like a thief, Leo Tolstoy planned his escape. He stood at the threshold of his home one last time, a silent goodbye to the ghosts of his past. And then he was gone. The great Count Tolstoy, fleeing into the darkness, a fugitive from his own life, in search of a final, solitary peace. For Sophia, the discovery was devastating. The man she had given her life to had vanished. He had no destination. He was simply running, a final, tragic attempt to reconcile the impossible ideals in his head with the messy reality of his life. He sought anonymity in a third-class train carriage, a prophet disguised as a peasant. But his body, old and frail, could not match the fire of his spirit. The journey was too much. He fell ill with pneumonia, his desperate flight for freedom turning into a final race against death. His journey ended here, at a tiny, obscure railway station named Ostapovo. The world's most famous writer lay dying in the humble home of the local station master. The news of his location spread across the globe like wildfire. The world held its breath. And in one of history's most surreal moments, the international press descended upon this tiny village, turning his intimate death into a global media spectacle. He had fled his home to find solitude, only to die under the flashbulbs and scrutiny of the entire world. His heartbroken wife, Sophia, rushed to his side, but was kept away by his disciples until the final hours. A final, cruel twist in their tragic love story. On November 20th, 1910, after a lifetime of warring with himself and the world, Leo Tolstoy was finally at peace. The clock in the station master's house was stopped, marking the moment the great heart had ceased to beat. The world mourned. Not just a writer, but a prophet. A global conscience. His funeral was a national event, attended by thousands. A silent protest against the church that had excommunicated him. A great titan of the 19th century had fallen, leaving a profound void. But the ultimate question remained. Who was the real Leo Tolstoy? His simple, unmarked grave gave no answers, a final testament to his rejection of all earthly glory. Was he the soldier who saw the face of war, or the pacifist who inspired Gandhi? Was he the aristocrat who indulged in every sin, or the ascetic who preached a life of purity? Was he the loving husband who created a masterpiece with his wife, or the cold prophet who broke her heart? The truth is, he was all of them. He wasn't a single person, but a multitude. A vast, contradictory soul, at war with itself. That is why his work feels so true. His radical Christian pacifism would go on to shape the nonviolent movements of the 20th century, changing the course of history. His novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, would forever redefine what literature is capable of achieving. He was not a saint. He was a deeply flawed man whose impossible standards caused immense suffering to those who loved him most. He was not a perfect philosopher. His ideas were often extreme and contradictory. But his true, lasting genius was not in providing easy answers. It was in his relentless, brutally honest courage to ask the most difficult questions. He left us with a final, hard-won piece of wisdom. There is no happiness in life, only occasional flares of it. You must learn to live on them. And in the end, we are left with the paradox. A man who sought God, but found humanity. A sinner who sought sainthood, but found truth. A genius who sought simplicity, but contained the world. And that is his eternal echo. The profound, chaotic, and beautiful echo of genius.